Right. I wanted to work for a newspaper. I wanted to be in politics and government. I was interested in television and the media. And I was interested in Abraham Lincoln from 5th grade in Queens, quite by accident. Our wonderful teacher, and it's so amazing how many people I meet that are influenced in a life-changing way by an elementary school teacher. I hope it still happens. So this teacher brought in literally a hat full of names, folded names, and assigned us to line up, take a name, and do a composition, as it was called, and utilize the middle school library we had upstairs, because we were in a brand new school that was a middle school and an elementary school. And I picked Richard Current's The Lincoln Nobody Knows. Well, I got Lincoln as the name. That's the lead of this story. And picked Current's book, and I was kind of off to the races. I was just enraptured.
And what grade is this?
5th.
Wow, so you're reading Richard Current's book in 5th grade and writing.
I was always a good reader. That was my one claim to fame in school. And it was life-changing. Just the mystery of the life, the mystical aspect of his being there at the right time and then leaving us too soon. It just enthralled me. And there were lots of books to read. And in those days, every February, every newspaper had a Lincoln story. The New York Times Magazine had a Lincoln story. The Daily News had a painting adorning the cover of its Sunday magazine every February 12th. And I just sort of started collecting what was being published and using it as my starting off reference library. And my parents were indulgent about letting me buy books. And I joined the History Book Club when I was a baby, like 13 or 14, and got the collected works of Lincoln for $5.95 as the premium.
And read it?
As your dad's and my other co-author, Mark Neely, always said, I read into it. I read it by now, but I didn't read it at 13. No.
And so, now, was your family into history, Lincoln? Was there any sort of other part, but it was really just this moment in school?
My uncle, who was an eye surgeon, who died when I was 4, was a collector. And I'm still finding things that he collected, and he's been gone for 70 years. But he was a kind of a strange influence on me without my knowing him. I just remember 2 incidents of being with him in my entire life. But he collected books, he collected Judaica, he collected American history things. When I sold my collection a few years ago, had it auctioned off, I chose, without knowing it, the same gallery that his heirs had sold his collection at in New York City. I just thought it was bizarre and another unexpected thing. So I think that's where I got it from, genetically.
Yeah, so it was
My parents were tolerant, but they weren't enthusiasts of history.
Right.
They were interested in politics, and we talked about politics at home, so that was part of the deal.
Which is what your professional trajectory begins at, right? I mean, you really are...
Well, newspaper first.
Okay.
Because I didn't go to graduate school because I had spent most of my senior year in college in the hospital. So it got me a draft deferment, but no clear path of what to do. And
so this is late 60s, early 70s?
It's 1969.
69, okay.
And that's when I graduated from college. And then I just got my cousin got me a job with her best friend's husband's weekly newspaper. I'm not ashamed to say it now. She was my guardian angel medically and also with a career boost. And her best friend whose husband owned the paper is Franklin D. Roosevelt's granddaughter. So I was so excited to tell her.
Remember that name, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
I now work at Roosevelt House, right? And I told her when I met her a couple of years ago, I said, Kate, isn't it amazing? I started my career because of you, and I'm ending it at a home you used to be in all the time. And she said, what was your first job again? I was kind of disappointed that she didn't remember. But it had been 55 years. It was called the Manhattan Tribune.
Okay.
It was a weekly newspaper that covered the west side of Manhattan and Harlem.
Wow.
And it had a white publisher, FDR's grandson-in-law, and a black publisher, Roy Innes, who was the head of the Congress of Racial Equality at the time. And so we covered politics, government, entertainment.
Wow.
And then Edith worked for the paper as well. First she was the ad manager, then she was a writer and editor. And then the paper did so badly as soon as I got there, it was like the end of it, that everybody got fired. All these amazing editors that I was so impressed with, one by one left because I don't think they got paid. I was getting $90 a week, so it was easier to give me my money. And then Edith and I were in charge of the whole paper for 3 years.
But you guys met, Edith's wife, right here. And you guys met in school, though, correct?
High school.
High school, yeah. Yeah.
We were on the newspaper then, too. And we were on the newspaper the day, 60 years ago, when Kennedy was shot. And our newspaper was in the AV room, which means it had a television, so we could turn on the television and watch the news from Dallas. Just the word spread in the school.
Wow.
So that was a benefit of being, or at least it helped us see what was happening.
So you had got into Lincoln. You were a collector. You were collecting articles. Were you collecting artifacts or prints or anything?
Eventually, I started. Not immediately. When we got married, we started coming to Pennsylvania with a friend of ours, a photographer who collected daguerreotypes, and he said, "Why don't you come and look for Lincoln?" So we did in Ephrata and Adamstown and all those flea markets. And then we wrote, Gabor and Mark and I wrote the book, The Lincoln Image, in 1984. And then when we tried to keep collecting, I remember we went to Brimfield, Massachusetts, which is a trove of historical material and furniture. And I saw a really great print that I wanted very much to own, a Lincoln print. And I looked at the price and I said, what is this price? I said, well, it's in Holzer, Boritt, and Neely, page 18. So I realized I was out of the collecting business. I had done the book, and I really didn't pursue as regularly as I'd had before.
So you were in media, writing for a newspaper that was, and it ultimately it's no longer around, right?
No.
Did it get
It ended
absorbed?
in 1973.
Okay.
And then Edith got a job with the mayor of New York as a speechwriter.
And this is mid-70s New York, so this
73,
is this is a heart of kind of
it was pretty tumultuous.
drop dead, right?
Ford to New York, drop dead.
Yeah.
And well, she worked for Lindsay and then Mayor Beam. I worked in the administration, but she had a much more fun job. She got to work at City Hall, which was one of the great buildings in New York from 1824, the oldest city hall the functioning city hall in the country. I think Independence Hall is older. It was a city hall. And then I covered a really raucous Democratic primary caused by redistricting in 1972, and I met Bella Abzug. We still remember the first time we saw her and speaking, and were smitten with her. Anti-war, pro-feminist, and she offered me a job as her press secretary.
I mean, a woman politician in New York at that time had to be pretty rare, if not unique.
Yeah, she was right after Shirley Chisholm.
Okay.
Was Bella, but before Liz Holtzman, and of course, and they made it. Shirley and Bella basically made it possible for women to compete and to be in every fray for every office all the time. But it was a rough 2 years. But I learned I said it at her funeral. That was my graduate school, working on a political campaign in 60 New York counties over 2 years, and losing by less than 1%.
And you were going all over the state at that point for that? I mean, she was obviously New York-based, but in the city
all over the state. She did really well upstate. It's, as somebody cruelly wrote, it's where people knew her best where she lost. It was kind of mean.
Yeah.
But it was a very close race and painful. And then she ran for mayor. And then she tried to come back for Congress a few times. And we stayed friends. She did a lot of interesting work at the UN. But then I went, after she lost the mayoral primary in 1977, Mario Cuomo was one of the top 2 finishers. And he asked me to work for him, so I worked for him. And then later, when he was governor, I went to work for him.
What was his role before governor? What was Mario Cuomo's?
He was New York State Secretary of State.
Okay.
which means that he gets to do the corporate seals when people start a company. But he made it a little bit more.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, he had settled a very difficult and vexing housing controversy in Forest Hills, Queens, that pitted the white community against the black community, the senior citizens against young people, and it was ugly. And he was called upon by the then governor to step in and be a mediator. And he did mediate it out. So he got well known in New York. And that's how he launched.
And you worked on his campaign or worked in his?
Only his mayoral campaign, which was, again, a disaster.
I'm seeing a theme with your work here.
Yeah, no. I still hold the record as a press secretary. Lost a Senate primary, a mayoral runoff, a mayoral general election, and then Bella's come back on the Upper East Side. So 5 elections in 14 months. No one has ever done that.
It almost sounds like Lincoln's biography in the early days, right?
Yeah, I'm waiting for the big prize, the big payment.
Yeah, exactly, right. You'll get there. Don't quit.
Yeah, so then after all of those losses, I went to work for public television. And then Mario asked me to come back and work for him.
Okay, so you went to Channel 13. WNET is a big public station. I remember that. We still have bags and various tote bags that we got from Channel 13.
I just broke one carrying books to the floor.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
The strap is broke. So one day at Channel 13, this baby-faced young man with a bowl cut comes into my office to meet me because I'm to promote his documentary about the Brooklyn Bridge.
There you go.
And I thought to myself, why does anybody want this kid to see anything this kid, didn't realize that this was the Ken Burns that we know now. This was the young Ken Burns. But he was hypnotic even then. I said, so what's this about? And then, of course, 20 minutes later, we were ready to do everything we could to... I wish he had stayed with Channel 13, but we had a terrible imposition of an overhead that, as young as he was, he knew he could cut a better deal elsewhere. So he went to the Boston station to be his host after that. So I never got to do any of his other shows.
So you just did Brooklyn Bridge with Ken. So this is Ken Burns' first film. Ken was on the stage 6 months ago.
Right.
And
on this stage, right?
Right. That.
Wow.
I mean, there with Jeff. Yeah.
This is his good side too.
Yeah. His is more of a slow move in, is what we do.
Well, he was very impressive. So that was a highlight. We did a lot of good stuff. But when Cuomo called me back, I got to work on all of his economic development programs. We went to Japan together, which was pretty exciting. We did Lincoln on Democracy together.
Yeah. And so, I mean,
which was a great project. Your dad
and
was
so
involved.
you have this, I guess the point is that Harold has this whole career in media and politics and so forth, and television, public television, and simultaneously you're going to conferences. You're writing at this point about Lincoln? Or?
So I was doing journal articles for about 10 years. And then, the three amigos, right, decided to do a book version because we're all interested from different angles. And people have always asked, how did you do that book? We'll never really tell, but we did a lot of it on the phone.
I used to sit and draw while my dad was on the phone talking to Mark. Conference calls.
Conference calls from Fort Wayne, New York, and Gettysburg, and we met.
In Wydensill Hall. I would sit there while you were on the... Yeah.
Your dad was on the phone, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
No, that was me.
Making sure.
No, it was my dad. Yeah, and I would draw on the back of the drafts of the Lincoln Image typescripts.
It was fun. I don't know how we did it in the day before email. It really, only one of us had a computer. Mark Neely, because he worked at a museum, had a word processing person and machine. And otherwise, we just typed and sent stuff to Fort Wayne. But we had a big meeting in Fort Wayne. We had a big meeting here at Gettysburg, and we had a big meeting in New York. So we had 3 meetings. Other than that, all phone and sharing ideas and chapters and redoing them. And
so you were a collector. You're basically a aficionado of Lincoln. You have no formal training.
But I was writing journal articles for 10 years before doing
about
Lincoln iconography, about his image. Right.
So you had a background in that, and then how did you meet Mark and my dad Gabor in? Is it like in a conference or something, or how did you do those?
I know exactly when I met your dad. Why can't I remember when I met Mark? Well, Mark, I do remember when I met Mark. Okay, I know both. So I was assigned by Antiques Magazine, which is a very glossy, serious, scholarly publication in New York, to do an article on sculpture of Abraham Lincoln. So this is 1978. And they flew us to Fort Wayne, and Edith went too, and a wonderful photographer named Joe Farber to do the pictures. And we somehow get out of Chicago to Fort Wayne in a blizzard. We go to bed in our hotel, which had a lot of windows like this. We wake up, the snow is almost 2/3 over the windows. And we said, we've got to get to the Lincoln Museum by 9 o'clock because we promised this guy Neely we would meet him. And the cab is like functioning as a snowplow. We had called him and said, we'll see you at 9. And he said, what? I can't even get out of my house. We said, we'll give you an extra hour. And we were sitting, and we'll pick you up. So we're sitting in a cab on the street that's been plowed, and we see this skinny figure approaching, wearing hip boots, plodding his way through that's how I met Mark. And then he was a great guide. Your dad, I was speaking at the Lincoln Group of Boston on Lincoln sculpture, the same topic, after it came out. And this guy comes down after the speech, and in an Irish brogue, no, that wasn't an Irish brogue,
Perfect Oxford English.
said, well, he had gone to Oxford, right? He did some work at Oxford.
Cambridge, yeah.
Cambridge, whatever. Yeah, England.
Not with perfect English, though.
No, it was, and he told me that he was very interested in my work, and he wanted to talk to me, and I said, who are you? And he's G.S. Boritt at that time, and I knew his work, and it was very exciting. So I met him at the Lincoln Group of Boston, but not in Boston. They never met in Boston. They just met in the area.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's how we all got together.
All right, and so then that became, and that would be your first book, right?
That was
is
my
a
first
Lincoln
book.
Image, right?
It wasn't your dad's first book, and
Yeah.
it was Mark's second book.
Okay, and that's...
And then we did the three of us we immediately, we had 30 things we wanted to say that we hadn't said in the book. So we did a book called Changing the Lincoln Image, which was privately published by Mark's Museum. It was really good, I must say. I liked it better than the book. And then we did the Confederate image.
When you did an exhibit, too, as I...
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Well, that's because of
that
your
was-
dad. Well, and Mark. We did an exhibit at the library.
Schmucker Hall here.
Schmucker Hall.
And then didn't it tour, or was that...
It toured to Fort Wayne. It toured to a lot of places. And we took turns going to openings. It was a very successful show.
If you're not familiar with the book, this is Harold's first book working with my dad, Gabor, and Mark Neely. It was called The Lincoln Image, and it looked at Abraham Lincoln in popular media, in particular prints.
Engravings and lithographs made at the period.
And how this evolved and how they sort of took the iconography of George Washington and so forth. And Lincoln became first this political figure. And I remember the story of the beard is very famous and all that.
And then I reread the Confederate image recently because, in this era, does it stand out there as something we shouldn't have done? And what did we say about the development of the Lost Cause image? And that was out front even then. It was a lot of new research. And, I remember which section each of us was interested in, but we pledged never to tell, so I won't tell. But there's nothing there that was hagiographical, nothing there where we said these are sainted figures. We just explained the development of Confederate nationalism, lost cause sentiments, and I think I'm amazed at how judiciously we handled it. Because and I think, I don't think people buy it anymore, but unless they go down to that bookstore in the Circle there that has all the pictures and statues.
We still have a couple copies. We still have a poster of it with the famous
And we had an exhibit
Yeah.
here too in the summer. I still remember. And Mark's Museum lent about 20 of the 100 images. And we were at the Holiday Inn. What is it now? The 1863 hotel. And your dad called because the power went out at Gettysburg College. And the humidity had gone from 50% to about 150% in an hour. So Gabor made a famous call to Mark and said, I think the pictures are wilting. And it was very scary. Mark was, I don't know, he was beside himself because he was responsible. But it's very interesting. When the humidity goes down, the wilting
Goes back.
it shrinks back, yeah. We learned that staying up all night with paper fans or something.
And so those are your first two books, but at this time you are now the press secretary for Mario Cuomo, who is the governor of New York.
One of the press secretaries.
One of the press secretaries, but also kind of as I remember, the presumptive Democratic nominee for,
I never thought it.
You never thought? No?
No, well, actually, there's a space difference. 87 is the Confederate image. 92 is when he flirted with the presidency, or the press flirted for him. But 92 and 3 is also when we all got together again, the old gang, Gabor, Mark, me, and also others, Frank Williams, Don Fahrenbacher, Jim McPherson, and we put together a book called Lincoln on Democracy, which sold a ton of copies. It was just a collection of Lincoln's great words on democracy and freedom, liberty, and
I mean, at the moment that the Iron Curtain is coming down, right? I mean, it was
in
very
Poland.
much timed.
Good memory. It was inspired by the Solidarity teachers of Poland, who they said, we have no Lincoln on ours. They visited Cuomo. We have nothing on our shelves about democracy. What would you recommend? And he said, Lincoln. And they said, the Russians took Lincoln away. So Mario calls and says, would you do this? And I got all my buddies together. We had Donald Trump gave us 10 rooms in the Plaza Hotel to do a retreat.
I remember that. We probably still have towels from the Plaza Hotel.
They were friends. Trump and Cuomo were friends at the time.
I'm
What do you
sure.
have?
Towel. I remember it was
Oh,
a
you
big
took-
deal for my
Gabor
dad,
took the towels,
a
yeah.
Gettysburg College professor to get to go to the Plaza Hotel.
It was
Like,
pretty.
It was a
It
big
was
deal.
nice.
A huge deal.
We also went to the theater together. It was a great.
Yeah.
It was a great period, and we produced a really good book, and it sold more copies than any book I ever did. But when I was doing it, this is what Mario Cuomo was like. For those of you who remember him, he said, "How are you going to do this? You're going to work and do it at nights and on weekends?" And I said, "Gov, I don't think I can. I think it's really a lot." And even, again, word processing was still in its infancy.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I would really rather take 3 months to finish this without having to come to the office. And he said, well, here's the deal. If you do it on your own, you can get half the royalties. The others I'm giving to New York State. But if you do it, if you do it in the office, right? If you take a leave of absence, I'll give you your salary, but you can't have any royalties. So I thought about it, and I said, well, I don't know if this book is going to sell, so I'll take the salary and have some peace and quiet. 80,000 copies later. But he would not let me do both. It's interesting. He was very straight about stuff like that.
Well, I imagine just ethically you have to be conscious of that.
Oh, yeah, they're very careful now.
Yeah, for sure.
Not really.
Albany, different place, right?
Yeah.
And so you were still very much in New York politics at that time, and that
Yeah.
was your business. You were
Yeah.
done with public television, but you were writing at that point the Lincoln image, Confederate image, changing the Lincoln image, and then Lincoln on Democracy becomes this significantly
Right. And then I
popular.
left Cuomo because he didn't run for president. Not that I ever thought he would. I just didn't because I knew him pretty well. And I got an offer to work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and that's where I stayed for 25 years.
Right,
Stopped
right.
gadding about and stayed in a real place.
And was the humidity under control there when you worked?
From time to time. From time to time, not. A lot of the Met did not have air conditioning when I was there because you don't need air conditioning for Greek sculpture. You just need it for the comfort of visitors. But the only places that really need humidity control are paper. It works on paper and tapestry.
Scandinavian sculpture
Yeah.
probably needs air conditioning, right?
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, so that's your career as, again, in media relations at the Met, which is world-class, arguably the best art museum in America.
I would say it, yeah.
And also just this, you're with
A lot of books. Well, I was lucky because, like Cuomo, my boss, Philippe de Montebello, the director of the Met, was very, he believed in scholarly pursuits. His curators wrote books, and so I wrote books. But it's interesting. You said I'm now an academic. I'm not an academic. I'm in, college administration. So I've never been on the academic side.
Okay, you're not
And at the
teaching,
Met,
but you're employed by a university.
I'm employed by a college, yeah,
Okay, yeah.
and a university technically. So, you very much realize at the Met, if you're working on the administrative side, that you're not on the faculty. The faculty are the curators. So there are
I see.
2,000 people working in administration and 120 curators, but they're the elite. Not
interesting.
us. Yeah, we're
So-
in support
But
and service of their aspirations.
but you have this side hustle, if you will, of Lincoln.
Right. And
I mean,
that's why I did well there, because they respected
because you would
that.
do events there. I remember you would do things at the Met and so forth.
Yeah, we did things in the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium from time to time. Yeah, that was
But
cool.
like Sam Waterston wasn't he there? And
Sam, and we did, and the White House too with Sam Waterston.
Yeah, well, you went other places, but yeah. So they were.
Yeah, so the
as much as
absolutely.
It was separate careers. It was also they
Yeah.
intercrossed.
I'm exhausted thinking about all this.
Yeah, it's like, we could just talk about roofing. I really just wanted to ask him about. I had this vague memory that Harold told me about working as a roofer, which makes no sense in how I know Harold. But like,
My father owned a roofing company.
yeah, and then
So summers I worked on the roof.
Yeah.
You can't develop a physique like this without doing that kind of work.
it's like his
Why are these people laughing?
Popeye-like forearms. Of
Right.
like,
I carried rolls of roofing paper and cans of tar that weighed 65 pounds.
No,
I don't know why I don't look
that
like
in the
Popeye.
summer, that is the worst job in the world, is to work.
Yeah,
on
but they taught the valuable lesson I learned from those roofers, except for things I can't say in public, and was drink. And I also worked in winter breaks too, so that's how I learned this. In the winter, drink soda, cold soda, and in the summer, drink hot coffee. I thought that was such a valuable life lesson, because they learned that if you drink cold drinks in the summer, it wipes you out, and you get overheated immediately after the effects of a cold soda. But if you drink hot coffee, you sort of maintain your being cold, but not terribly cold.
There you go.
I'm telling you, this was a very important lesson. Could I just say, I shouldn't have even answered the first question without saying how honored I am that Andrew asked me to do this. He is such a success story. You should all be so proud of this young man. He is amazing. And also to that, old friend, my longtime friend Jeff Shaw is here, is a surprise and an honor always, and always great to see him. We just sort of catch up with where we were at the last conversation, even if it's a couple of years. But we're on email, so it's okay. And you,
right.
Jake, who I've known since you were a baby, literally.
Well, yeah, pretty close, I think. Yeah, like 78 or 80. Yeah, I would have been very, very young, about Andrew's age.
I'm supposed to have the funny lines.
Exactly. Well, I always have at least one how young Andrew is joke in everything I do. So that was it. We're done. Okay.
So now I have the privilege of working on a campus at the most hellish time it is to be on a college campus. I mean, I used to demonstrate for
Harold,
things on campuses.
what do you do now? What's your?
So I'm the, yeah, right.
He left the Met about 5 years ago or so, 6 years.
8.
8 years ago. Yeah.
And I was hired as the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. And what appealed to me, and talk about, this intersectionality, which is a hot word in academics now, is that it is housed in the New York City home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, which most people don't know about. They know about Hyde Park. But this was their New York house. This is where FDR's mother bought it for them as a Christmas present and gave them a little drawing and said, "Home with Mama." And Eleanor must have said, "Oh, Lord, we got away from her and now we're going back." She offered them a half of a double townhouse on 65th Street between Park and Madison Avenue. The catch was she was going to live in the western side and Eleanor and Franklin in the eastern side. They had 2 children at the time. People think it was a wedding present. They were married a bit. And in fact, they had already lost a child. So they had she had 3 pregnancies. And Sarah, the mother, immediately took the walls down once they moved in. And so, as Eleanor later wrote, my mother-in-law was on my side of the house for the next 25 years. Sometimes, she said, at the least expected moments, which is the only sexy thing that Eleanor Roosevelt ever said, when you think about it. And she had a rough time with her mother-in-law, but she also credited her mother-in-law with getting her out of her domestic life. Sarah said to Eleanor, and not in a friendly way, you're not a great wife, you're a terrible mother, you can't cook, you don't seem to have any other interests. Why don't you come with me to the Lower East Side settlement houses where I volunteer? And so Eleanor left the home and found her calling, which is helping other people. And her first job was, and keep in mind that she was almost 6 feet tall. Her first job was as a yoga instructor and a dance instructor.
Eleanor Roosevelt's first job was as a yoga instructor?
Yeah.
There
At the Henry Street Settlement House on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And from there she got into the women's auxiliaries of the Democratic Party, became very active in politics and public service, the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and her mother-in-law really pushed her to that. So that's the good side of we have their paintings on opposite sides of the open parlor, and so they're going to stare at each other through eternity at this point. But I should have said the second floor of this house, which is a tiny library, it's like a tenth the size of this. I don't even know how to describe it. It's just a small room with wood paneling. This is the room where Roosevelt had his transition headquarters from November 1932 to March 1933, which is when the inaugurals were still held. And this is where he built the foundational building blocks of the New Deal. And on February 5th, 1933, February 5th is my birthday, so that's one date of the 20th century that I remember, Frances Perkins, the state labor commissioner, came to this room that we use every day and said to her boss, the governor, the governor, she knew she was coming for the job interview that might make her the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet. And she was ready for the offer. And Roosevelt said, Frances, I want to make you the first woman Secretary of Labor. And she said, Governor, I'll do it, but I want to know that you will let me work on minimum wage, maximum hours, disability coverage, child labor laws, and most important of all, that program we started in Albany for old age pensions. So FDR, who, as far as I've learned in the last 8 years, never said no to anybody or anything. His technique was to say yes and then deal with it later. He said, okay. And so our little library is where Social Security was born.
Wow.
Anyway, so I'm very fond of my new life. And FDR, he wrote his Gettysburg Address on a train, unlike Lincoln. When it came out here, right close to here, right, for the Peace Memorial, that way. I'm sorry, Andrew. Yeah, I should have known that. He actually wrote the address on the train, and was here for the, what anniversary was it of the 75th, and met USCT veterans who didn't fight at Gettysburg, but he met some surviving African-American Civil War veterans.
Well, that's just an amazing moment, I think, from the history of this country that FDR is up there to dedicate this memorial to peace. We call it the Peace Lay, Eternal Peace Memorial. And within 2 years, they're going to World War. And it's bringing this country together to fight a world war, essentially.
Well, we spent a lot of time at the table talking over lunch about divisiveness and how regrettable it is and how hard it is to work out, and how the media, which I now write about, right, in my last few books, seems unprecedentedly partisan, but it's really not. It's kind of a legacy of the press of the Civil War, which was, aside from the North-South dichotomy, was either Democratic or Republican. And people got the same skewed version of the news from the newspapers as they do today from Fox and MSNBC.
So it was the same. I mean, even if you go back to Jefferson versus Hamilton in the papers and so forth, and broadsides, like the ethos is the same in the media.
Absolutely.
But it's obviously the technology, and I would say the speed has changed rapidly.
Who was the first president to use the term fake news? The answer is the first president. That's one of the reasons he didn't run for a third term, is he couldn't stand the press criticism. But yes, you make a very good point. It's embedded in in the press culture, and it's always been thus. Wait, you said something else, and I've dropped it. But you may
Well,
not
just the evolution, this idea that how sort of divisive and mean-spirited the
Right.
press can be and how negative it is. You read at what Jefferson and Hamilton were saying about each other, or Adams, whoever you want to pick.
usually
from this.
without signing their names.
Well, right. Or having some intermediary kind of be there.
But you know, in 1860, with all of the divisive rhetoric and all of the vitriol and all of the separatist sentiment from the South, the presidential election got 80% turnout. Oh, I know what I wanted to comment. I mean, it's all white men, but it was 80%. You said, but the speed is different now, and I stepped on that line inadvertently. I found so much evidence in reading about the era when newspapers came out once a week, twice a week, and then, you know, in Lincoln's paper, the Illinois State Journal, was originally bi-weekly, and then it became 4 days a week, and then it was 6. And people thought it was breathtaking. You could get a story overnight. I mean, I think there was the same kind of reaction as there is to instant news on our phones.
This click. Yeah. And so like the telegraph obviously would have been transformative.
And people thinking it was unhealthy.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, the telegraph, which revolutionized war coverage in the Crimea and the Mexican War too, a little bit, changed everything. Couldn't hide.
Well, then that Lincoln and others were learning how to use that to their advantage. I mean, isn't that one of his great geniuses, is to understand the power of the media? I mean, sort of what we talked about that first book on the Lincoln image is he,
exactly,
as much as he presented himself as this log cabin, you know, hick.
Right. I don't know why all you artists want a picture of me unless I'm the homeliest man in Illinois. Meanwhile, he's always sitting for painters and sculptors, which is not, sculpting is not easy because they put calipers on your head and measurements, and he went to the photographers whenever he was asked to. I mean, he never said, I want to get my picture taken. But in the book I did a couple of years ago, The Presidents versus the Press, my theory was, and I think I got it right, that the presidents who left the most lasting impression, positive or negative, and who were able to dominate whatever the media was at the time, were the people who found new forms of expression that really gave them a way to get around professional journalists. Lincoln. At the end of the war, Lincoln was writing dispatches from the front that appeared in the newspapers every day. The last 4 weeks of the war, he was the chief correspondent for the biggest newspapers in town, in the country. Franklin Roosevelt, whose voice was so perfect for radio, and there was the intersection of technology and talent. And he only gave 36 fireside chats, but I mean, people like my parents were convinced he was on the radio every day.
Yeah,
the voice was so strong because there was also newsreels. There were also other radio addresses, but he mastered that medium. And then, you know, Kennedy, they found the perfect place for press conferences. The State Department, a perfect auditorium. They invented this color. Have you ever seen a president who did not stand in front of this color? This kind of curtain? That was invented by John Kennedy's people. Have you ever seen a president speak without the presidential seal in front of him? There was never a seal in front of a president until Pierre Salinger said, let's put the seal in front. And they said, what seal? There's a seal of the president. It's on that flag in the Oval. And that's when it all began. And he was, of course, I used to run home from my school to catch his 4 o'clock press conferences because there was
Kennedy's, yeah.
Yeah, well, not Roosevelt's. Yeah. I'm not that old. And
you crawled home for Roosevelt's, right?
And Donald Trump. I mean, Barack Obama, to some degree, understood the web, and he had a website, and he really irritated journalists. Who would ask the press secretary, how does the president stand on this issue? And they said, oh, check the web. And it's on the website. And Trump and Twitter. Social media, Twitter.
Well, and I think I would say that Facebook was an Obama thing, and in particular, the fundraising changed drastically, and especially in the Democratic campaign. The old school fundraising of big donors, and then this new kind of $25 donor thing. And that's a big part of it. I wonder how money has changed, too, with the technology.
I got 20 requests for $1 in the last 10 hours, so from everybody in the United States.
It's big
but
business. Yes,
they all mastered that. But in terms of just reaching people, Trump and Twitter, that has to go down in history as one of the most effective uses of media in history.
Certainly circumventing the press, right? I mean, the standard bearer. Yeah, it's well, also just how media changes, and then the old powers fade away, and you have these new, and all of a sudden, Mark Zuckerberg's the most important media mogul in the world.
Now all we have are old powers, right?
Well, it's I mean, are there new old powers?
New old powers or old powers.
How are we doing for time? We're good. Do you want to keep talking? You want to do questions? Or you want
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we can take a few questions if anyone has any questions about roofing and coffee and stuff like that. Yoga in the early 1900s.
Jeff has. Oh, authors are so kind to each other. Usually. Jeff asked what I was working on now. So I have a new book coming out in February. I have actually, I think I said this to Andrew last time I saw him, I have found and appropriated the last remaining quote from the Gettysburg Address that has not been used in the book title. But I think it's appropriate. It came to me one night. It was my last great thought was this. Brought forth on this continent, Abraham Lincoln and American immigration. So it traces the story of Lincoln's dealing with the issue of foreigners coming into the country, and is it timely? Yeah, kinda, right? Mm-hmm. And he was not perfection at the beginning. As we say, he evolved on slavery, so did he evolve on immigration. And the shorthand is if new citizens were Republicans, he was fine. If they were Democrats, he was not so fine. But he learned a lot at the minute the Civil War began.
Well, and he was also an immigrant himself in a certain way, moving from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois. That those were rugged journeys across frontier.
Well, every white American was a descendant of an immigrant, or every black American was the descendant of forced migration. So yeah, there was a commonality. But one generation is here, and then
you're there.
They're here, and there is a kind of reluctance to welcome others to share. This is an age-old thing in America.
So that comes out in February?
Comes out in...
So check your local booksellers.
Right. And I'll be around. I'm hoping to do a lot of the events. The Presidents versus the Press was, in a way, the most depressing project I was ever on, because it came out in the beginning of the pandemic, and all of these great travel plans I had went right to Zoom, or evaporated completely. But I'm really glad Mr. Zoom invented Zoom, because it was so life-saving at school for students. And for authors and people who like to take to the road and speak to people, but it just isn't the same. And it wasn't the same for the book. Meeting people and signing books.
To be out in a situation like this with wonderful people.
Just a word about the Lincoln Forum.
Yeah.
We've never had more than... Well, we used to meet at the 1863. This is our 28th symposium. And we used to meet at the 1863, and then when the Wyndham was built, we had this big decision. Should we stay friendly and small, or should we try to become bigger? And it was not unanimity about growing that quickly, but starting tomorrow, we have 350 people coming to the Lincoln Forum. I guess
great. Congratulations.
I think it has to do a little bit with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is coming.
Sure.
And then she will be part of the non-cemetery event. Did we tell everyone that it's at the Majestic? Yeah. So because I was very involved with it this year, because I'm sort of Doris's unpaid agent to get her to come. And for those of you who saw her History Channel documentary on Lincoln, docudrama, the incredibly Lincoln-esque young actor who portrayed Lincoln in the series, but I don't think he had any speaking lines, did he? I can't remember. Yeah, he did. Yeah. He did. He's going to be here at the forum and at the dedication day to read the Gettysburg Address. And Doris is going to introduce him. So I'm going to introduce Doris, and Wendy Allen will introduce me. But that's the entire program. Just a series, a series of introductions, which will go on. So
until you get to Lincoln.
Yeah, well, by then I'll be gone. I'll just have the introduction. It's sad because when the government shutdown crisis was looming, the park apparently, last time there was a brinksmanship on this issue, had to start closing down early. There were apparently so many entrances they have to put chains up, and so the park told the organizers it's going to be the same thing. We don't know when they're going to vote, and so we're going to have to start. Are you saying that the cemetery may be closed down? Yeah, it may be closed down. So they had to make the decision to grab the Majestic. And once grabbed, I think there's probably some financial arrangement involved or whatever, but now they're in the Majestic, even though the Senate is going to pass the continuing resolution on today or tomorrow. And then the president comes back from California to sign it. So another crisis averted. But these things have terrible impacts, these inability to decide before the last minute. And here, this is one of those impacts. And it's as Andrew said, the 160th.
I mean, I think it was 150th in the fall. The government was shut down for about a month, and you couldn't go to the national park.
Was that 150?
I think about October of 2013, right? I mean, yeah, it had a huge effect on people here. Means to some people's advantage, to other people's huge disadvantage.
And we are going to have a motorcade, Andrew, as I told you. We were supposed to take horse-drawn carriages from the Wills house to the cemetery, which we thought was really cool. That was going to be the most exciting part of it. And it was going to be over 40 degrees for the first time in 8 years. So now we're going to take the carriages from the cemetery to the Majestic. I know. It's like downhill.
The horses are probably happy.
Yeah, they're happy, right? They get to go down.
Although they're made to work. We get now I'm going to sound like de Blasio here, with actually the horses like to pull carriages. I always said that was one of all the tragedies of Gettysburg. There was many, but one of them was that when Edward Everett pushed from October 23rd to November 19th because he couldn't get his speech ready in time and memorize it. And so he went from being late October weather in Gettysburg for this moment to now all the leaves gone and usually like 20 degrees. And
I know the turning is pretty nice here. New York didn't get any turning. It's lovely.
It's pretty here. It's actually nice.
But you don't think that it's just because of the speech, do you, Everett?
I thought he had a stroke and he
couldn't. No, prostate infection.
Oh, prostate, and that's why he couldn't.
Why do you think there's that tent you can see in the back of the platform? That's his comfort station. Yeah. Which apparently he used frequently, as they say, but not during his 2-hour speech. They didn't stop him for the 2 hours.
Well, there you go. Well, let's take a couple more questions in the back here, please.
Who created the painting of Lincoln on the cover of Lincoln on Democracy?
There's not a painting. It's the penny profile photograph. Oh, you're right. Oh, the reissue of Lincoln on Democracy. Thank you for asking, my friend. So we reissued the book while Mario was actually starting to fade. So he wanted to have another edition out, and Tony Bennett. You sort of gave you set me up to give a dramatic answer, but since I didn't know what you were talking about, anyway, Tony Bennett did a painting as a gift to me once. He just showed up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art one day, and he said, "I'm Tony Bennett." And I said, "I know, there you are." He said, "I'd like to be your friend." I said, "Wow, that's great." So we became friends for 20 years, and he loved art. He loved museums. He wanted to have a contact, and then we just did become friends, and we went to so many of his performances and socialized with him. He's just a beautiful person. And but he painted in 2000, he painted Lincoln of the Lincoln Memorial. And we used that on the cover of magazine. It's so interesting. We just heard from his widow just before we left. That, so yeah, it was a big loss, losing him. But he had a really good run, didn't he?
He did all right. He did all right.
Do you know that he could sing until practically the week he died at 97, 6, 7? That part of his brain was unaffected by his other issues. His accompanist would come to, this is not about Lincoln, but it's an interesting story. It gives us some hope. People would come, his accompanist would come to his apartment and play an arpeggio, and he would begin singing The Boulevard of Broken Dreams or whatever, from obscure songs, from the beginning to the end. And that was what he knew, and that's what stayed. No one understood it.
Well, if you're Tony Bennett and need to hold on to one thing, that's a smart thing to do. It's lucky. Yeah, but I think the brain works that way. I see that with my dad. He still has music. A lot of
Music
stuff goes
is
away, but music is there.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's
it's kind of
apparently a
invisibly.
different part
Yeah,
of the brain.
yeah.
Yes,
Let's take one more.
There's
right
one.
there.
There's one there.
Professor.
You mentioned early on that Richard Curran had an impact on you as a young man, as a kid, really. What are the 2 or 3 books that have most impacted you as an adult?
Well, can I do one more kid book? Stephen Laurent, who is largely forgotten now, wrote a book called Lincoln, A Picture Story of His Life. It sounds like a children's book title, but he was my first Hungarian Lincoln friend. He claimed to be the first person ever imprisoned by Adolf Hitler. He had been the editor of the Munich Illustrated Press and a critic of National Socialism. So Hitler threw him in jail, and he was then thrown a book to read. Talk about fate. Emil Ludwig's biography of Lincoln in German. And he determined, so he got out of prison. He was a political prisoner, not Jewish. He went to London, and he sort of invented the form of the picture magazine that we here became familiar with Life magazine and Look magazine. So he created a book in that format, but it was to chronicle every photograph of Lincoln ever made, to go beyond the original Meserve study and preceding the Ostendorf and Kuhnhart versions. And I was just entranced with that. I always knew I was going to find an unknown photograph of Lincoln. I never did, but that was my dream.
And that was your connection to the imagery of Lincoln. That was the
He
start
was,
of it.
yeah. And we got to meet him a few times. He was a fascinating man of great charm. And he wrote books on Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. And his life lesson to me was publish your own books. I never quite figured out how to do it, but he stayed a wealthy man because he took his book Pittsburgh, An American Story, published it himself, and his income source was selling that book to tourists up to the Warhol Museum in those days at the Carnegie Institute.
Interesting. So he was a businessman that understood owning the rights and managing the distribution was where the money was, not the creation of it.
But he also had a beautiful estate in Lenox, Massachusetts that was quite nice. So I think that's what has influenced me since. To that degree, nothing. I mean, look, I worked with 2 people who wrote books that have never been equaled in their respective fields. Gabor's Lincoln and the Economics of the American Dream, which was actually a story of publishing that didn't go right? It was published by MSU Press because your father would not cut the book. And he was probably right. And Mark Neely's The Fate of Liberty, which was the first real study of the suspension of constitutional rights by Lincoln to the press and the civilians during the Civil War. So those were influential. And of course, McPherson, which is still the Bible of Civil War. It's the book I turn to when I dare to write about a general or a battle. I just want to see if I have it right. And I think those are the ones. Donald, to some degree. I didn't agree with David Donald's thesis. I criticized it in a book review, and he still was friendly. Because the book was, do you know, this is another, there's titles of books that we never got to do. I wanted to call our first book Of the People, By the People, For the People, Abraham Lincoln in American Prince or something, and the Scribner said, "Are you kidding? It's the worst title I've ever heard." So they said, "What about the Lincoln Image?" And we thought, "Oh, we're onto something. That's a great brand." Do you know what Doris Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, was supposed to be called? Abraham Lincoln, Master of Men.
I remember that, actually. Yeah, I do remember that.
And her editor asked me we had the same editor, said, "What do you think of it?" I said, "It sounds, one, like he was a slave owner, and B, this was the period when people were writing that Lincoln was gay." I said, "It sounds like an S&M book, a little bit." So she said, "You're disgusting," and hung up on me. But they changed the title. And
how'd that do?
And yeah, that did pretty well. And that title has gone into the culture. I mean, the idea of a team of rivals.
Well, yeah, and then
It's
Obama
gone-
adopted it in his like it's become kind of a political guidance.
Absolutely. It had been done before, but it doesn't matter because when Doris did it, I mean, the concept of hiring your rivals for cabinet positions was kind of pro forma. Henry Clay became Secretary of State when he lost the president. Anyway, the nomination. So, and what was Donald's book called? Which ended up as Lincoln, same editor, was originally called Events Have Controlled Me. And that just wound up as the epigraph of the book. I do not claim to have controlled events. Events have controlled me. Which I always thought was, Lincoln was just saying that because he wanted to get people off his back about black voting rights and black recruitment. But that was the only part of Donald I criticized. So that's another great title that never was. I'm sure there were many more.
That's what Donald's biography was going to be called?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
Events have controlled me.
And that was just called Lincoln, wasn't it? Yeah, which is a good title, too.
Not bad.
All right. Is that good? I mean, that was a great answer. Harold Holzer, everybody. Thank you very much, Harold.
Yeah.